probably the biggest tool used right now to kind of propaganda tool to turn people against America is what people are told is a history of incredibly brutal, endless chattel slavery. And somehow, when that story is told, history seems to begin at the United States. There doesn't seem to be an awareness that the world and civilization have been going on thousands of years earlier, and chattel slavery had always been happening. Um, but in the book, Randy, you argue that really America's track record on slavery is significantly better than anyone wants to admit and better than most people know.
This is one of my big things in this book. So, because that's the big, cudgel that people use. America's not good. Our
Ah,
founding's horrible. Because we were we allowed slavery and all this stuff. And, of course, like you said, you got to go back thousands of years of history. Slavery is still going on today.
oh
Um,
gosh, yeah.
but at that time, of course, we were 150 years old as colonies when I should, well, yeah, let me get 150 years
Yeah,
old since like um,
because we began
Jamestown
landing
and
Jamestown, and yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
Plymouth and all that stuff. And so, and the slavery was introduced into Virginia around, 1619, as we know.
Mhm.
We like to talk about that. But yeah,
Oh
that's the
yeah,
fact.
that travesty.
So you got to go 150 some years. So we've had all this history of slavery, and nobody's countering it. There started to be an abolition movement, springing up in England
Mhm.
and in the colonies. And around the time of the Revolution, it was starting to gain some traction. And so when the Revolutionary War happened, states started to outlaw slavery in the North because they weren't as dependent on slave labor like
Right,
the Southern plantations
right.
were. But like Benjamin Franklin and others that had slaves, he freed his, but um, it was common practice. And so, but a lot of the New Englanders, like the Adams, didn't have slaves. And so again, it wasn't all the founding fathers that had slaves, and the ones who did actually took active steps to
Yeah,
begin ending the institution, and
yeah,
that
and
gets
treated them
lost
well.
in yeah, and that gets lost in this story. And so by 1800, all the states north of Maryland had outlawed slavery, Pennsylvania and all of them. And in fact, Benjamin Franklin became the president of the Abolition Society of Pennsylvania, which its purpose was to go beyond Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania had already voted to end slavery. And so, um, but that wasn't all. Like there were multiple steps. Even the Constitution itself is anti-slavery. When people talk about the three-fifths clause, they think, oh,
Oh
they only
gosh,
thought of
yeah,
black people as
yeah.
three-fifths of a person. Well, no, I mean that was a pro-abolition provision, and anybody who looks at the history and honest about it knows it, because the Southerners wanted every slave counted in terms of apportionment of votes in
Yeah.
Congress. So by limiting the number of votes, and it was a compromise, that's the way things go, but it was a compromise. It limited the number of representatives that the South could have. So it was a nod to the fact that this institution of slavery was not right, and that you don't give these people the right to vote. And so that was the compromise reached. And so that was that. And then they also, oh, good.
So what you're saying, I think it sounds, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds like the three-fifths compromise was not to say that black Americans or slaves were three-fifths of a person. It was to say, gosh, if we count all of these slaves in the southern states because of apportionment, the South is going to have more votes in Congress and will be able to push slavery farther. But if we go with the three-fifths
Perpetuated.
compromise, it'll keep the South from getting that leg up, and we can keep moving toward abolishing slavery. Is that about right?
No, yeah, that's exactly right. Because there were lots of fights going on. Like one of them was what happens when people from the South move to the North with their slaves.
Mm,
And so that had to be decided that the local law would win. In other words, if you keep your slave there, it's not if you traveled through, they made provisions for that. But if you move there, those slaves were going to become free.
mm.
And a compromise that it was that they would allow people to go bring back slaves who had escaped.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that was
fugitive
another one of
slave
them.
laws.
Yeah, the extradition, or however they, that sort of extradition is what the provision was. But another compromise, and this is where Jefferson has to get some big points, but they wanted to end the slave trade. And again, so these northern states, for the first time in modern history, are passing laws abolishing slavery. So no other countries around the world are doing that right now. It's not like America was behind
Yeah.
the eight ball or behind the power curve. We were ahead. We were at the
Yeah.
front side. And our abolition movement was moving ahead quickly. And so part of that was when the Continental Congress was meeting and they passed the Northwest Ordinance. At the same time, they were passing the Constitution across the street. It outlawed slavery in the new territories. So Ohio, Michigan, what would be Ohio? Its Northwest Territory was Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, those states, and so Illinois. So that was the first big with federal government power, that said we're not going to have slavery in those territories. And Jefferson wanted it to extend all the way to the South. He wrote an ordinance to that effect a few years earlier, but that ordinance fell short by one vote in committee because a man was sick that day who would have voted for it. And so Jefferson lamented it. He's like, that's horrible. Heaven was silent, but I know that eventually this will change. And then when he was president, in the Constitution, there was provision to end the African slave trade, bringing slaves over from Africa or from the West Indies or whatever. And so they said the compromise was 20 years after the Constitution becomes in effect, more or less, 1808 is when you can end that. And so again, we're dealing with trying to keep the Union, but deal with the fact that the North doesn't want these slaves. And I know it's wrong. And the Christians are behind this movement.
Yeah.
And so in 1807, in March of 1807, they passed the legislation to be effective on January 1st, 1808. They wanted it to happen the very first day it could. And so that's what happened. And who was president at that time? Thomas Jefferson. And he signed it into law. And he also introduced legislation when he was a member of the Virginia legislature to end slavery in Virginia. But it just couldn't get the number of votes we needed because they were dependent on that society, on those plantation society. Yeah. Certainly the leaders were. And Washington himself, he was like, I would vote in a minute. There's multiple letters to Lafayette and others.
I've read some of them.
George and Morris in New Jersey, Governor Morris saying, hey, it will not lack my vote if we vote to abolish slavery. I want it. He said, I don't think it should happen abruptly. I think it should happen gradually, which is what it was happening in the northern states, just so people could be reintegrated into society. And then when he died, he had two wills. And I don't know, nobody knows exactly what was in the other will, but the will that he chose, he said, burn that one. But he said, this is the one I want. And so he had two wills, and in the will that he chose, and maybe it was the same in both wills, but in any case, that he freed all of his slaves at his death, because he wanted to set an example to, this was 1799, December 1799, to all the other, to his colleagues, to his fellow Virginians and plantation holders and that sort of thing. And there's a famous quote by an AME, black pastor at the time. And he said, with this act, he blotted out the only thing that could be held against this wonderful man. He set an example for history. And so that was the head of the AME congregation, which the largest African-American one at that time, essentially. And so he really appreciated that gesture. And so, there was a lot going on in the anti-slavery at the founding. So the founders were not slave lovers or holders. There were some that obviously they protected the institution. And even Jefferson, he was a slaveholder till the end. He freed just a few because he was massively in debt. But he took actions, and he wrote about it in his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, saying, justice can't sleep forever. Unless we deal with this thing, it will eventually, God will. He said, God's justice can't sleep forever. So that's the way he saw it. So he said that quote is in the Jefferson Memorial. So.